Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. My name is Tom Fowler, and I'm the chair and organizer of Grand Rounds. This week, as you can tell from the screen, where we welcome the team from Scot-GEM. I suspect most or all of you will know what Scot-GEM is, but I will leave it to Kirsty and Fiona and team to explain exactly what it is. But they're going to talk to us about what makes Scot-GEM special. What's the unique selling point of Scot-GEM compared to other medical schools around the UK? I remember the germ of the idea of Scot-GEM about, it must have been 12 years or so ago, when John Connell and I were sat in his office on level 10 as was at the time, and he floated the idea of there being a graduate entry medical school, and how could the University of Dundee work to be part of that program. And from those initial discussions, it's turned into Scot-GEM, who have now graduated 2 years worth of doctors now, I think, or is it more than that?
4.
Someone's going to tell me.
4 cohorts.
4 cohorts. So there you go. Time flies when you're having fun. We've had Scot-GEM speak before. We had the Grand Rounds. If you search on the YouTube page, you'll find the planning of Scot-GEM. Then we've got the initial what happened in our first year of Scot-GEM, and we've had another Grand Round, which was what's going to happen when we graduate Scot-GEM. So here we are now talking about the 4 cohorts of been through and the learning experiences that the team have had. So, Kirsty, are you going first?
I'm going to pass over to Fiona to start.
Righty-ho. So Fiona Graham's going to start first, and then we'll circle around to other speakers through to Kirsty at the end. Usual Zoom rules apply. Do turn your microphones off unless you're speaking. You're welcome to leave your camera on if you'd like. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or you can wait until the end, put your hand up and ask questions like we used to do back in the old days. So thanks very much to Kirsty for organising this, and I'll pass on to Dr. Fiona Graham, who's the Programme Director at Scot-GEM. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for that very kind welcome, and also for a little bit of the history of Scot-GEM. I would love to, Kirsty knows this well, I would love to actually do a detailed history of how Scot-GEM came about. But that's for another day. So thanks very much, everybody, for coming along to this Grand Round today. And it's concentrating, yes, it's Scot-GEM, but it's concentrating particularly on the dispersed clinical teaching that we undertake as part of Scot-GEM, which is quite a major part of what we do for reasons that you may know, and if not, hopefully I will enlighten you in my the first part, the introductory part, which is just putting Scot-GEM in context, particularly for any of you that are not familiar with Scot-GEM. I've got some team members here today, some key team members who are going to give some detail on their particular areas of expertise within Scot-GEM, and I'll let them, when it comes to their slides, I'll let them introduce themselves and tell you what the role is in Scot-GEM before they go on to give you the detail of their particular section. Next slide, please. So as I say, just for a bit of context, so what is Scottish Graduate Entry Medicine? Well, the clue's in the name. It's a graduate entry medical course. It's the first and at the moment only graduate entry medical course in Scotland. We have very wide-ranging graduates. They don't have to have just a science degree. We've had musicians, we've had lawyers, we've had an astrophysicist. So we have a very rich mixture of graduates coming to us, and it's very exciting to be involved with training these people as doctors, because they bring so much richness from their background. In addition to that, they have to sit the graduate entry aptitude test, so the GAMSAT test, and that's quite a searching test for them. And so that has quite a bit of science in it as well, but it also has other elements that help us decide that people are well placed to train as doctors. So, and it's a 4-year course, so it's compressed into 4 years, but it's not a 5-year course compressed into 4 years. It uses innovative approaches to medical education, to try to do something different, to take these very talented graduates and to train them in the 4 years, but in a different way, as part of our mission to produce generalist doctors, foundation in generalism, with an enthusiasm and an interest in remote and rural practice, particularly in Scotland. And we're a partnership, a very quite complex partnership. We've got 3 universities, obviously led by the University of Dundee and the University of St Andrews, as well as the University of Highlands and Islands. And then we've got 4 partner health boards, which you can see listed there. Next slide, please. So this is just a timeline of Scot-GEM development. As Tom said, it's quite a long history now. We're coming up to 10 years from when it was first conceptualised. And it was the winning bid. There was a number of bids to the Scottish Government to produce, to develop this graduate entry medical course. And it was the dispersed, the remote, the rural, the generalist aspects that were particularly attractive at that time. So our first students, first cohort matriculated, as we said, in 2018. And in first year, they're based in St Andrews. They're matriculated with St Andrews, and they're based in NHS 5. All the teaching takes place there. But from second year, they are dispersed across another 2 health boards, 2 very rural health boards, NHS Highland and NHS Dumfries and Galloway. And then from third year, dispersed across Scotland, Tayside come in as our 4th partner health board there. And they're dispersed across Scotland during their longitudinal integrated clerkship, which Lloyd will tell you a lot more about in a moment, where we have students from way up in Orkney right down to the far southwest. So that's a very exciting innovation within Scot-GEM and within this idea of distributed clinical teaching. So our first cohort graduated in 2022. So they are now into second year of specialty training, and we're following them really closely to get an indication of how we know they're fantastic. They're really good doctors. We get really good feedback about them, but we really want to know whether they're enthused and excited about this idea of working in remote and rural Scotland particularly. Next slide, please. So I talked about innovation, not just squashing a 5-year course into 4. We talked a bit there about the longitudinal integrated clerkships. We have the generalist clinical mentors, a brand new role developed for Scot-GEM. These are GPs who really lead the students' education across 4 years. A very exciting development, very highly regarded, gets fantastic feedback from students. And Pana, I'm delighted to say, is here today. 7 years of experience as a GCM, and she'll share her thoughts around the GCM role and also about the fact that it is distributed across Scotland from year 2 onwards. We have a bespoke clinical interactions course, which is clinical skills and communication skills, developed to be complementary to the case-based learning that Scot-GEM employs in first and second year. And it's a very comprehensive course that the students follow. And then finally, the Agents of Change programme, spiral curriculum throughout the course, which is envisaged to support students to become future change leaders, as well as being clinically skilled. Next slide, please. So I talked about distribution across Scotland. The map of the health boards on your left, I think, if you're looking at the screen. If you look at those, Highland, Tayside, D&G and 5, it's a massive landmass that we're taking in there, and the vast majority of it is rural Scotland. And then if you look at the map, the other map, that's our distribution of our LIC practices across the country, and it's a map that we love to show if we're asked to give presentations about Scot-GEM, because it's so exciting that we have been able to bring on board. Most of this is new capacity. This is not stealing other clinical capacity. This is new practices that have been brought on board to support our students' education. Next slide, please. So just a few key messages before I hand over to Lloyd about the distributed clinical teaching model. And I think some of the things we've learned are actually around the importance of what might be considered the softer aspects of it. So yes, we need to have a very robust programme of teaching and education, but we really need to start from the first day with building relationships with clinical teams and educators across the partnership. We have to have fantastic communication, really important. We have to pay attention to the burden and the expense of travel and how we can make that easier for our students. We have to make sure they've got safe, appropriate accommodation where they're placed, and we need to make sure that they've got appropriate learning environments. And think about when you're recruiting practices in rural areas, some of these are tiny facilities, and we've been able to support some of these practices to develop facilities that were suitable for our students to be in, and that's been an exciting aspect of Scot-GEM. So all of this is essential, not just to our education, but to our student wellbeing. The local education providers need to be involved from the start. With Scot-GEM, local education providers were involved well before we matriculated our first students, and it was really essential to making sure that we could get buy-in for what was seen in some situations as quite honestly a crazy idea. So we really needed to get the local clinicians, local educators, and develop them as champions for what the vision for Scot-GEM and that distributed education model was. It's really important that we develop educators, and it's very gratifying to look at the number of clinicians that have come on board as educators for our students in the most rural areas of Scotland. And what we found is that it's beyond just teaching, it's beyond just allowing students into clinics. It's actually about having them involved in the whole process. There was enthusiasm about being involved in interviewing prospective students, doing exams. We didn't plan in the first instance that we would have formative OSCEs in partner health boards, but that came from our partners saying they'd really like to save the students having to travel back to either St Andrews or Dundee, and they would be keen to do that. So there's been a lot of learning around how you deliver exams, how you assess students, and then things like portfolio supervision, which has given clinicians the opportunity to follow the students across all 4 years, and really these things have all helped to foster a sense of belonging to the course. And flexibility of opportunities to fit in with clinical commitments, which I think has been really important. And finally, I mean, partnerships are challenging. People have different ideas, obviously, but when you can bring together the strengths of your partners, your partner organisations, the health boards, the universities, it's such an exciting outcome, and it really has benefits for our students, for our educators, and hopefully for our populations in the future. So I think I'm handing over to Lloyd now.
And apologies, I'm in a hotel in Newport in Wales, and I've already been kicked out once due to dodgy Wi-Fi, so hopefully that won't happen again. Anyway, hello everybody, my name is Lloyd Thompson, I'm a GP, and I'm Deputy Programme Director and Convener for Years 3 and 4 of Scot-GEM. If I could have the next slide, please, Kirsty. I plan for the next 5 or 10 minutes is really just to talk you through, I think, what would be considered the cornerstone in many ways of the Scot-GEM one of the cornerstones of the Scot-GEM programme, and certainly one of its unique aspects in terms of medical education in the UK. And that clearly is the Longitudinal Integrated Clerkship, or the LIC, or the LIC, depending on what you want to call it. This is the third year for all students. Given that Scot-GEM's key mission aims were generalism and remote and rural medicine, And then also, given that, we know that there's not exactly an awful lot of new hospitals or new GP practices being built across Scotland, but yet if we are going to introduce new medical students into the system, we need to have somewhere to teach them. And there have been all sorts of clever innovations for years 1 and 2, and perhaps Hannah will touch on that. But actually for year 3, there was this real conundrum of, well, how do we take 55 as it was then, 70 as it is now, medical students, and how do we make sure they have, good quality clinical placements that will help them achieve everything they need to achieve in order to meet, outcomes for graduates? What we also realized at the time was that actually the number of GP practices across Scotland who are not involved in undergraduate medical education remains significant, although it's less significant now than it was. And I think Scot-GEM, one of Scot-GEM's reasons for its success has been that ability to engage and recruit practices who have never been involved in undergraduate medical education before to take our students. So I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through this, but essentially year 3 it's required for all students. They undertake this 43-week longitudinal integrated clerkship in a GP practice. And it is the entire academic year, essentially. If I could have the next slide, please. This is just a flavour of what happens. So the student is in their GP practice every week. That is the mainstay of what they do. They are there 2.5 days every week. And when they are there, yes, there's a bit of the initial, sorting out who you are and how the practice works and shadowing and getting to know things. But actually pretty quickly, we strongly encourage our tutors to get our students consulting, get them in front of patients, seeing patients, taking histories, examining, piecing it together, coming up with management plans, and doing that as early as they can. Now, clearly for different students, this happens at a different rate, but actually that is the goal for all of our students, certainly before Christmas in Dillick here. And there's a huge amount of learning comes from that. I appreciate not everyone in this call will have worked in a GP practice before, but GP practices remain an absolute melting pot of the human condition, in that you see everything from cradle to grave and from acute to chronic, and it's a huge opportunity for our students to learn. And what's fascinating is that we know patients actually really like to be involved in the education of students, and this allows patients to do that too. So our students do that, then alongside that they spend time with their GCM, and I won't steal Panna's thunder. And they also then go into hospitals. So they do, we do have to recognise that there will be lots of things that students won't commonly see in a general practice primary care setting, so it is important still to have appropriate hospital exposure to have that learning as well. And as Fiona's mentioned, our students undertake an agent of change component in year 3, and this essentially takes the form of doing a significant quality improvement project, which I'll not really talk about today. If I could have the next slide, please. We really wanted to understand a bit about our practices. So I think we anecdotally know that we've had success. We've recruited a whole lot of practices, and by and large, most of them seem to have stayed with us. So I think we wanted to understand, well, how successful have we been in one sense? Why has that been the case? So just some numbers on the screen for you. When we started back in 2020, and we had 55 students, and they were dispersed amongst 54 practices across the country. As time has gone on, our student numbers have gone up, as everyone else's. The practice numbers have gone up slightly, but actually the bigger change has been more of our practices taking more than one student. And actually normally this is because practices have had a positive experience with one student. Actually they become really keen to then start to build that community of practice within their general practice. Our retention rate is high. Actually, most of the practices that were with us at the beginning are still with us 5 years later. Not only that, we've managed to recruit an additional 14 practices. And the most encouraging bit is that actually around about 1/3 of our practices have never been involved in teaching. So these are practices that have never, or certainly not for many years, taken students at undergraduate level. And these are often practices that don't take trainees, didn't take students, or completely removed from any form of teaching and training. And yet they've become, key parts of the delivery of undergraduate medical education for Scot-GEM. Anyway, so having identified the data, we thought, well, let's understand a bit more about it. Next slide, please, Kirsten. So we decided to speak to our tutors, and myself and colleagues did some interviews just to really understand what are the benefits and what are the challenges. We adopted a qualitative process to look at that data. And then we took the information from those interviews and then essentially turned it back on the practices and used it to construct a survey and sent it to the practices en masse to get an understanding of the magnitude of the effect of these things. And that's the data that I'll just present to you now. If I go to the next slide, please, Kirsty. But the enablers. So none of these will be a surprise to people, I suspect. But it's still helpful to understand that they are truly the enablers. So it's the relationships, it's the fact that because the student is in the practice for the entire year, that relationship that the GPs and others build up with the student is incredibly important and incredibly powerful. It's the community impact. Our students are not just breezing in and breezing out. They're not sort of appearing for 4 weeks and disappearing. They are moving to that community, they're living in that community. And actually, particularly in our more rural areas, the impacts of that go way beyond the confines of the general practice building. The educational value, we all know that teaching improves our own knowledge, because actually when you're having to demonstrate your own clinical reasoning to a student repeatedly, well, that actually improves your own clinical reasoning, doesn't it? So that educational value, incredibly important. And then the personal benefits, this idea that it's, it doesn't take very much full-time clinical practice to realize that clinical practice is draining. And actually there are huge amount of benefits that come from being able to take a little tiny bit of a step back and do some teaching with the students in your practice. And then the practice benefits, practice is benefiting from having, face it, young, enthusiastic people in their building who are really keen to learn, and that enthusiasm can spread throughout the practice. And then, of course, students are still undertaking substantial quality improvement work, which again can bring about real change to our practice. It's not all perfect, as the next slide will show you. Clearly, we don't do everything perfectly. There are some issues with support, and I think in a dispersed model, I think what we've learned is it's very important to be proactive with, identifying support needs. Sometimes there are support gaps, tutors not realizing student needs, students having needs that we're not realizing. So some issues around support gaps. Resource constraints, I don't think this is entirely confined to our LIC program. I think lots of different sectors of the NHS are feeling issues with resource constraints, but clearly it affects us as well. Workload pressures, again, not unique to Scot-GEM or any other program, but this idea that, the amount of work that needs to be done in an average day for an average doctor working in the NHS is not going down. And that clearly has an impact on teaching as well. And then logistics, and this is more unique to us because of the complexity of our program, particularly students in more rural areas needing to go to, urban settings for hospital exposure, that can become tricky. And actually sometimes practices can feel that, they're managing their own timetable for the student, then they're managing the health board's timetable for the student, and then the student may have their own timetable as well. And actually, when all of that combines together, that can be a bit of a logistical challenge. That also can be a barrier. If I have the next slide, please. Which, as I said, we took that qualitative data, we sent it out to our practices, and I think we had a pretty good response rate. So I'll speed up and I'll move on to the next slide, please. Again, none of this is a particular surprise. The majority of our tutors think that hosting students is rewarding, it's improving my own skills. You can see it on the screen. Students are a positive presence and the patients like being involved in education. And, clearly these are actually quite powerful enablers, with the vast majority of our GP tutors either agreeing or strongly agreeing with them. I think the last question on reflection was slightly unclear. Looking at the free text comments, I think what we meant was, or what meant was this concept of having a student in your practice means that you're teaching practice and therefore an attractive place to work. I think some tutors actually interpreted that as our students graduate, they do their postgraduate training, and then they come back as GPs. Clearly, Scot-GEM is not at an appropriate stage in its evolution to be able to say that yet, because our most mature cohort of trainees are still in training. So I suspect the data for the last question is not as useful as it could have been. And then if I could move on to the barriers, again, the barriers are not insignificant. We do get that. Time and workload, money issues, clinical space in the practice, these are all challenges for our tutors. Encouragingly, for the majority, for the majority of our tutors, These barriers are not major barriers. They are sort of slight to moderate barriers, but they are not insignificant. But interestingly, things like challenges with the student relationship or difficulties with IT systems or student support needs, these are things which could potentially be pretty major issues. We all know the challenge, or a lot of us will understand the challenge of having a trainee, and you end up with a difficult relationship with that trainee, and then that can become really difficult. That's not really an issue for our tutors, which is quite encouraging. And then if I move on to the next slide, I think despite the challenges, we asked the very simple question of, how is it going? And I think 98% of our tutors will still say that it's positive or very positive, which we find incredibly encouraging. Last couple of slides. Next slide is really just recommendations we've come up with. Oh, I need to keep clicking, Kirsty, sorry. But I'll just whiz through these. I think the bit in red is probably the most important bit. I think there is a fear that when you are the tutor for that student for the entire year, bearing in mind that at the end of that year, this student will be sitting their medical written finals, there can be a huge burden to feel this need to teach the student everything they need to know. But that's not the job of any tutor or trainer. That's the student's job to learn stuff. The job of any tutor or supervisor is to provide exposure to clinical learning and to support the student as they develop their clinical reasoning, and to be open and vulnerable and all the rest of it with the student. But it's not to provide teaching on the 300 topics in the GMC's MLA content map. And actually providing reassurance for our tutors that your job is not to be the fount of all knowledge, because actually the more that we work clinically, the less that we feel we're the fount of all knowledge. We are there to support our students to discover the information and answers they need for themselves. And that's, I think, a really key message that we continue to try and get across to our tutors. Could you mind just clicking up the rest of the bullet point, please, Kirsty? Yep, student support systems. We are proactively developing these and trying to make them more visible, both at the unit, in Dundee and Tayside, but actually probably much more importantly within our health boards and then in those more rural areas. Yes, clearly some issues around logistics and planning, and trying just to make it less of a burden for practices to navigate the timetabling complexity. And then finally, just continuing to our practices feel as much a part of the program as they can. That when you're a remote and rural practice, clearly geography will often make you feel quite distant from things. So we're trying as best we can to really make our practices feel part of the program, and not having, for example, Dundee-centric materials. When you're several hundred miles away in Caithness, can feel pretty remote. And I think I have one more slide. Okay, yes, so discussion. GP tutors enjoy it. It's all very positive. It's not perfect, clearly, and we have some learning that we will take away to make the programme better. And thank you very much. I think we'll take questions at the end, so I will hand on to Panna next, please.
Thank you, Lloyd. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Panna McKeaton. I'm the Clinical Interactions course lead for Scot-GEM. As Fiona mentioned, I was a GCM up until the end of July, so I have 7 years of experience as a GCM. So I'm very pleased to speak to this aspect of the presentation and introduce you to the Generalist Clinical Mentor model in Scot-GEM. This is a picture of my very first group in Scot-GEM, my very first GCM practice, actually, so it brings back really fond memories. Can you click onto the next slide for me, please, Kirsty? So what is a GCM? And before I begin, actually, this is a very rare picture of GCMs. One of our GCMs recently retired, and so somebody had the bright idea of taking a picture of all of us, and so slightly unconventional with her headband and things, but a lovely picture of the GCM team, so I thought I'd share that with you. So it's a multidimensional clinical academic role. When you are a GCM, you have a day in practice, you're embedded in a general practice, and then you have your academic role teaching at the practice, but also at the university. So the role combines teaching, mentorship, and clinical service, as I've just mentioned. The GCMs are experienced GPs, and as I've mentioned, embedded in local practices, and they support Scot-GEM's distributed and socially accountable mission. Now, one of the founding missions of Scot-GEM, and I think Fiona touched on that, as did Lloyd, was that we were to produce high-quality doctors, I've written something down here, with a generalist focus for NHS Scotland, a focus on rural medicine and healthcare, and improvement to contribute also to local communities and the health service through supported agents of change projects, so having social accountability. And GPs are so well placed to teach and support this mission, being primary clinicians in the community. So it's an ideal role, a novel role that really does support Scot-GEM's mission. Could I have the next slide, please, Kirsty? So this slide tells you a little bit about the change in the GCM model across the 4 years of the programme. Now, I'm most familiar with years 1 and 2, having just been a year 1 GCM. And what happens is, as a year 1 GCM or year 2 GCM, you have a group of 4 to 8 students, so a small group that you see weekly, in fact, twice weekly. And how it works is Tuesdays is really for the clinical interactions course, so our combined clinical and communication skills course, where the students are at the university, either in Tuesday morning if you're a year 1 student, or in the afternoon if you're year 2. And then the students come to practice with us later on in the week, Wednesdays if you're year 2, or Thursdays if you're in year 1. And what we focus on is clinical and communication skills with procedural skills mainly in the CLIC course. And then those skills are then brought into GCM Day and students are allowed to practice. But the beauty of GCM Day is that then the GCMs will bring in real patients to try and contextualize the learning in the real world setting in general practice. By year 3, Lloyd's just touched on the longitudinal integrated clerkship. The GCM model changes to small group teaching still, but they also meet weekly for half a day with their regional GCM. Now, the students are obviously distributed, but regionally they come together. This also provides some support and prevention of sort of isolation as the only student in the practice. And the GCM is really responsible for facilitation and topics that the students sort of bring up, that there can be some facilitation of the teaching without having to teach whole topics. So it's a supportive role. And in year 4, again, sticking to the small group learning, this time they meet monthly for half a day. And the emphasis then changes to focusing more on professionalism and preparing for practice. Although I'd say that some of these themes of learning really run through from years 1 to 4, just the emphasis changes. Could I move on to the next slide, please, Kirsty? So this slide's a little bit heavy. Draws on a paper that Kirsty will mention later, where several members of faculty have been involved. So I drew on the findings from that, but also I have to say I've just finished my master's dissertation this year in June. And I was looking and exploring the experiences of stakeholders on the Scot-GEM programme. And one of the groups that I was speaking to were my colleagues, the GCMs. And so a lot of the points on here come from my own research and interviews that I did with GCMs. So the attractions of the role, certainly personally for me, were that there was a combined clinical academic contract. And now with looking at portfolio careers and wanting some variability in your working week, which Lloyd touched on, this makes it incredibly attractive, or an incredibly attractive role. The flexibility, as well as CPD time, roped into the week, which again is highly attractive. The fact that you can have meaningful mentorship and impact with your students with that longitudinal relationship that we have, that really is the best part of the job, I would say, that relationship with students and the ability to sort of follow them through, observe them getting stronger, being able to support them with some of the more challenging aspects that they find more challenging. Again, this has been touched on, but one of the other attractions of the role is that it expands medical education to rural areas. Now, both Fiona and Lloyd touched on this. So it enables clinicians to teach without relocating to what's traditionally thought, if you're going to be an educator, a medical educator, you'd be in a big centre somewhere urban. And actually, this draws on all of that expertise from our rural colleagues and gets them involved in teaching, which in turn strengthens partnerships between universities and rural health services, which enhances local clinical capacity because you're bringing in GPs, sometimes recruiting GPs to areas where perhaps GPs wouldn't ordinarily go and work. And improves job satisfaction and retention by offering meaningful academic roles in these underserved settings. So some of the challenges. Now these, for some, if you've got a career focus, really an initial lack of sort of academic progression, particularly in the early GCM roles, where there were clear pathways were lacking for promotion within university academic structures, may put some people off. But I know that there is change afoot, and there have been several discussions because it is difficult as a clinician GP working as an academic at university. How you sort of work your way through the promotion system is not clear at all. But I know that there is change afoot about trying to make that a little bit clearer and easier. So that may be a challenge. Balancing your clinical and academic duties can be challenging. Logistical complexity, which Lloyd touched on. Sometimes the distributed teaching across rural sites requires coordination, travel and adaptability on the part of the student, but also I'm thinking in terms of assessment, and doing that in a coordinated fashion sometimes can be incredibly taxing and complex. The variable backgrounds of GPs, differences in prior teaching experience. We're all different ages, all come from different backgrounds. And that's one of the strengths of the programme, but equally ensuring that we have robust induction and ongoing support, which we do have, is a challenge. And although retention is high, long-term sustainability may be affected by the workload issues that I've mentioned before, and also the progression opportunities, but as I've said, hopefully changing. Could I have the next slide, please, Kirsty? So just some final thoughts. I'd say GCMs are key to Scot-GEM's success, recognised in a GMC visit report where, again, I've got a note here, GCMs are a valuable part of the programme and students were very positive about their experience of learning with them. We consistently score highly. Well, I keep saying we, I'm not a GCM anymore, but I was, for the NES feedbacks. Students love spending time with us. We love spending time with students, and that's been consistent throughout the course. So GCMs embody generalism, realism and social accountability. They strengthen rural healthcare and also medical education in rural regions. And just as a personal reflection, and this is a picture outside the practice that I currently work at of a group of students that I had, and I just love these pictures, they're joyous, so I thought I'd share some of them with you. So I suppose just to close, I wanted to share a few reflections from my time as a GCM. It's been a role that really has challenged and stretched me. The balancing that I've mentioned before of the clinical work with teaching and mentorship, but also one that honestly I found so incredibly rewarding. It's really been the best job that I've had. I've seen just how powerful longitudinal relationships can be, not just for students, but also for us as educators. And watching students grow in confidence and competence over time, being part of that journey really is such a huge privilege. The GCM model has helped me to grow professionally. I've developed new skills, contributed to curriculum development and assessment, and connected with colleagues across Scotland in ways that I never would have thought would have been possible otherwise. And has led me to my new role as Click Lead this summer, which I'm really excited about. So I'd like to conclude by saying the GCM role is a role that brings meaning, connection, and impact. And I believe it is a role that is worth celebrating and sustaining. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mogas. I'm the Clinical Teaching Fellow for Scot-GEM in Dumfries, and I've been asked to speak to you a bit about my role. So I'm going to give you a little bit of just a bit of a tour of my job and why I think it's the best job ever. Next slide, please, Kirsty. So just a few general points of Clinical Teaching Fellow jobs in general. They are quite variable, so some of them will have like 100% teaching time, some of them will be 50%. I think some of them can be less than that, so just be careful what you're signing up for, making sure you're happy with it. If you're maybe relatively quite junior, so to speak, you might want to have a bit more clinical time so you don't de-skill. They are non-training, so they don't count towards training, unfortunately, but you can get lots of stuff to develop your CV. I wouldn't just do it for the sake of the CV. One of my friends tells me that he would absolutely hate to do my job. He can't stand really dealing with students, which is fair enough. At least he's honest about it and he knows himself. He's self-aware. I love my job. I think it's great. I do want to be involved in medical education all the time. So I think it'd be great for me, but don't just do it with the CV, but you will naturally pad out your CV a bit when you're doing this job. And it's quite flexible. My one in particular lets me really set up my week how I want to. There's very few things I can't move, though I can't move an OSCE out of the way, but I can move my bedside teaching to allow a student to attend something that they wanted to attend and so forth. So that's quite good. And I find it very fulfilling, just as everyone else has been saying, like working with students, working with other people involved in education, and meeting wonderful patients that are keen to facilitate your teaching has all been really eye-opening and rewarding. Next slide, please, Kirsty. So yes, this is no prize for guessing. This is me. Why draw yourself and stick it onto a PowerPoint slide? My answer to that is why not? So this is me. I'm going to take you through a bit about my job and what I'm going to do. So next slide, please, Kirsty. So my contract is essentially a 40-hour week divided up into 10 sessions. So that's 4 hours a session. So I really think of it as a morning and an afternoon being 2 sessions. 70% of my time is supposed to be teaching. So 7 of those sessions is for teaching, 2 of them are for development, and 1's for clinical time. And I actually use one of my development sessions to do a bit more clinical time because, like I said, it's my second year in the job, but I'm kind of post FY2, so to speak. I'm not done core training, so I like to keep up my skills as much as I can. But this is quite flexible. Some weeks I might do a bit more clinical time if the students are away, and other times when they're coming up to exams and we're doing OSCEs, I might need more time to do teaching. But so far my bosses are happy with me, and I take that because they've not fired me yet, so I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And I do renal clinics because my supervisor is a renal consultant, but I guess I could do whatever I sort of wanted, and I work in CAU in the acute medical receiving unit because that's probably the place that's most likely to be metaphorically on fire in the hospital. Next slide, please, Kirsty. So here is a slide of some bedside teaching. So we've got a patient that is unwell and has some interesting signs and a story to tell. Patients are at the centre of what we do in medicine. And but never fear, medical students here, they've got an enormous stethoscope and they're coming along to learn and present cases and do many cases and all these wonderful things, and hopefully leave with a big smile on their face. So bedside teaching is a big part of what we do, and probably a big part of what you guys receive or have done yourselves. Next slide, please. Simulation. So this is a wonderful picture of our sim suite. There's a door, there's a handle. We go inside and we do some sim. So we do sim quite regularly, and we even started doing sim for work experience students that we get in the local area. It's kind of an informal thing that's slowly becoming a bit more formal. But generally speaking, the students love doing a bit of sim. It's a whole part of medical education in itself. And I remember doing it as a student, and now seeing it from the other side of the glass is really interesting. And it's a part of medical education that I didn't really think about too much as a student, I guess. But we get to do it quite regularly, and you get to even create your own sims and really challenge yourself. So it's a big part of my job, and I can do it with the help of Stuart Japp, or SimTech, who does pretty much every sim that I've been involved in. Next slide, please. So yeah, this isn't supposed to look as spooky as it does. We don't scrawl escape room in blood over the door. It's just red, and it's an unfortunate choice of colour that I picked. But we do escape rooms in Dumfries. I did not come up with this idea. My predecessor, Katie Percival, who's got the brain the size of a washing machine, she's a genius. She came up with escape rooms which are medically orientated. They're good for learning. There's a lot of ILOs. They cover a lot of stuff. They involve like a live simulated patient, but it's also quite gamified. And the students always have fun doing them. I do it for the final years in particular. I don't really have time or the ability to do it for any more students. It's quite a lot of actually effort on our end to set them up, to set up all the dominoes, only for the students to knock them down in about an hour, but they enjoy it, so we do it, and it's worth it, I think. So if anyone wants to see one, you'd have to come to Dumfries and arrange with me, but I'm happy to have spectators if you want. Next slide, please. And yeah, me again. So I did the certificate to last year, the postgraduate certificate, and this year I'm moving on to postgraduate diploma. So as part of my development time, I'm allowed to develop as a CTF and make sure that I'm grounding my work in educational theory. And I find it quite interesting learning all this sort of stuff, but I wouldn't I know other colleagues who completely disagree and hate doing it and don't want to do it. And I'm not saying which university, I'm not doing it at Dundee, so I'm not trying to slate Dundee's course or anything. This isn't, I don't do it at Dundee. But other people found it quite dry and quite heavy, and they didn't want to carry on with it. So this is sort of each to their own thing, but it's part of my development. Why not? This is one of those things that nothing else will look good on your CV that you've done a few other things. Next slide, please. And just a few other things. So I do things like CBDs, mini kicks is one-to-one. So there is a bit of mentoring there, certainly, and welfare checks and making sure everyone's happy and okay. OSCEs and mock OSCEs that take up a lot of work. I'm recently started doing assessments and stuff as well officially at the University of Dundee, and as well as tutorials and workshops. I work across the programme, so I'm not assigned to a particular department in the hospital. So I'm not like a renal CTF or an acute medicine CTF. I'm supposed to teach across specialties, which is in its own challenge. Well, I had two options. I could either just learn and retain all the knowledge of all these other specialties and teach them, or I can befriend people that are experts in these specialties and get them to teach. And I opted for the latter. So I applied them with coffee and chocolates, and they will offer to teach all these pediatrics and obs and gynae stuff that I do not teach anymore. I do the occasional bit of surgical teaching if my surgical colleagues are away, but generally speaking, I do opt to arrange all this teaching for my students, but I don't necessarily give it all myself. I focus on teaching the medical side of things, and anything else I'll call on the experts to do in the relative subjects. I'm happy to take any questions or emails later or whenever we do them. But I think that might be my last slide, Kirsty. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. Thanks, everybody. And it's just me to finish up. I'm Kirsty Alexander. I'm based here in Dundee. I'm a medical education lecturer, and my post is actually attached to the Scot-GEM programme. So the bulk of what I do is to support all my colleagues in Scot-GEM, both my university colleagues here at Dundee and in St Andrews, and also my NHS colleagues, to evaluate the curriculum and to pursue their own scholarly activities, whatever they're interested in. And I also support and lead research on Scot-GEM as well. So I'm just flashing up here 3 outputs that we've had this year that you might be interested in. The first is a review paper which talks about the development and innovation in our course, and that's published in Frontiers in Medicine. And we've got a piece about the GCMs, the Generalist Clinical Mentors that Panna was talking about. And then we've got a piece that Marcus led on, he's just spoken to you, which is commenting about foundation allocation on underserved areas. So just to show you some really recent work that we've got going on and show you the scope of the kind of thing we do as well. So at the moment, we've got 2 big projects running, which are externally funded. One's a big data project, which is looking at the origins of the Scottish GP workforce. And the other one's a project which is just starting, and that's looking at our LICs, which Lloyd talked about, our longitudinal clerkships, because this year in Fife we're doing an innovative trial of a different type of LIC, where instead of 10 months in a GP practice, the students spend 5 months in ED and 5 months in GP. So we're doing some research on that as well. And that's all I wanted to say. More contact details are there, and I think we probably just have a few minutes left. So I don't know, pass back to Tom or and open the floor to questions.
Thanks very much to all of you for your presentations today. We're up to 30 people in the audience, so that's excellent. Does anyone have any questions? I'm just loading up the chat. There's nothing in the chat just now. Has anyone got any questions or comments from the audience? So there's so much to applaud about the whole program. The range of people that we get into it. You spoke earlier, I think Fiona mentioned, the range of graduates in terms of topics and subjects. But there are clearly a different group of people from the people who come through, I'm using quotes here deliberately, normal medical school, the traditional medical school processes. What challenges have you found, do you think, that are perhaps different from the standard route entry school straight into medical school, or has it been absolutely plain sailing and no bother at all?
Yes, I shall come in there. So it hasn't all been plain sailing, but it's been it's been a very interesting voyage of discovery, and each cohort has been quite different. And I think that's the thing, it's difficult to generalize, because our theory is that the first 1 or 2 cohorts were almost mopping up a group of people who had thought about doing medicine in the past, but found that Scot-GEM, the way that Scot-GEM was set up, was suiting them better. So we had quite a lot of really quite interesting, enthusiastic, some older people, a lot more older people in the first cohorts. So if there was challenges with those cohorts, it was more around the real practicalities, like it's a dispersed medical program, and you've got people that have got a house, or they've got a family, or they've, these kind of really practical issues. So over the years that's changed. We've got more students coming straight from their first degree, so straight into Scot-GEM. So they have more, as you would expect, but a few more support needs, because they're younger, and they've not been out in the workplace as much as our previous cohorts have been. So from a student support point of view, we've had more student support to deliver, but I mean, I can see what my colleagues on the call, what their comments on it are. But in general, I think that old adage that 10% of your students cause 90% of your problems, and it's very true, and it's very important not to let that mask the fact that so many of the students are actually outstanding. and really inspiring when they tell their stories of where they've come from, and why they want to do medicine, and why they want to be in Scot-GEM.
I think it's interesting that you say that those first cohorts. My perception from on the outside of it is exactly what you said. It was the people who've been waiting around for quite a long time to find a way into medical school, because the previous systems just couldn't accommodate them. So they were perhaps older, been through many things, been through other professions, pharmacists, paramedics, nurses, people who have been professions allied around medicine, who'd afforded an opportunity. I wondered if that would continue, but you've just said actually it's perhaps moving more towards a pre-med American style system of someone goes and does pre-med in whatever that may be, and then rolls almost straight away, even without a gap year, because time's moving on. They're 21, 22. You don't want to wait around. I think that's very interesting how that's evolved, and I wonder if it'll. It's almost like you've dealt with the incidence of people wanting to be doctors who were not, and now you're onto the prevalence of people who their plan is medicine through a slightly different way. Okay, excellent. Has anyone else got any thoughts or comments? What
maybe
future of the future? Tony, hello, Tony.
If nobody else, but it's
Please do.
That thing about teaching older students. I mean, sometimes older undergraduates, but older undergraduates. And I remember when you mentioned the pre-med in the United States, because I went to the United States in my mid-20s as a doctor. And I remember they got me to do some undergraduate teaching, and I mean I couldn't believe it. Because they were so well prepared. They knew more than me. Certainly the first time I went in to talk, they knew more than me, and I certainly had to. I felt I had to up my game. I said, I don't remember any. Certainly not me, but I don't remember any medical students in Glasgow University in my day doing all the work before the talk, and doing all the work before the tutorial, and having all ready with all these very difficult questions. So are you finding that with these older group of people, they're there, come at it from a different, is that enjoyable teaching for you all, and enjoyable experience, that kind of line of it?
Yeah, I'll come in again. Yes, definitely. And it's something that's been commented on really from the beginning. And from our first cohort, when they went into foundation training, there was great sort of celebration, because they were really enthusiastic about foundation training, really organised. and they'd often, if they were in the rural areas, they knew their way around. So there was a lot of enthusiasm around that as well, that sort of being prepared, being enthusiastic, not being cynical as maybe their younger counterparts become over their 5 years. And if you've chosen to give up a job and go back into being a student, then you're really committed, aren't you? You're really committed to the work, and that shows.
Yeah.
I think that's something I know this from personally, because my wife was a graduate entry medical student, albeit 20 years ago. So I remember her saying to me, I was already qualified, but while she was at medical school, her thought was always, I don't want to waste this opportunity. I don't want to waste a single second of what I've got here, because it took a lot to get here. And I suspect the same argument, you were at work, you were working, earning money, and suddenly to go back for 5 years, 4 years, 5 years to complete a degree is a big deal. There's a question in the chat from Jill Scanlon. Great presentation all, much better insight into the programme and all the roles and responsibilities of staff. Well done. I wonder if Panna and Kirsty would discuss a bit more detail around some of the research they've conducted and or about to start. Very research active group with publications from this year, and Lloyd with his PhD just starting. This is great to see. So perhaps just to round off the meeting, Panna and or Kirsty, just give us some ideas of what your research is about or is about to be.
Oh,
I'll let
I
you
go really
start,
quickly?
Panna.
Or do you want to go, Kirsty?
No, I'll let you start.
Oh gosh. Oh, Jill, thank you. Jill's actually my supervisor. So she's I think she's intimately understanding my research. What was the point? So I think I touched on it very briefly. I was exploring the views of stakeholders. The title was Exploring the View of Stakeholders on a Community-Based Medical Education Programme. And because I was so intimately involved as a GCM in the Scot-GEM programme, I decided that was the programme that I was going to focus on. But the reason for doing so was because there just isn't very much published at all about the experiences of stakeholders on these programmes. We have a few community-based medical education programmes in the UK, but really our inspiration for Scot-GEM came from the Canadian model, NOSM, and also in Australia. And there's lots of publications about the model there and how successful it is and how it works. But I was just, I suppose, thinking, gosh, I'm on this program. It's amazing. There's all these innovations. And I want to explore a little bit more about what we do and why it works. And hopefully then, because we know that this form of medical education is brilliant and works, and our population's getting older and we need more clinicians that understand about generalism, I would like to focus on this aspect of the course and figure out what works really well, and what recommendations I could take from my research. So that's that in a nutshell, but I'm perfectly happy to discuss it further if required. Kirsty, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Panna. And thanks, Jill, for the question. So we have a really wide range of research going on in the project, and a lot of that's kind of driven forward by the different educators in all our distributed settings. My research focuses on selection to medicine, undergraduate and postgraduate experience, and how that impacts later career choices. So quite a few of my projects link back to that. And I mentioned a couple of them in my presentation, which are the two that I'm leading on at the moment. And concurrently to that, kind of supporting educators to evaluate the programme. And in the very last minute, I'll pass to Lloyd, who can tell you about his PhD, which is just about to start.
Good.
Wrap it up very quickly because it is 13:59. Suppose we are in the unique position in Dundee where we have two different cohorts doing different curricula, sitting the same exams, and Scot at the end of the year. And Scot-GEM is unique in the UK in that we are the only graduate entry 4-year course sitting their AKT at the end of 3rd year. So there's all sorts of stuff about that we don't really understand, and I'm going to try and understand it more. With that, I'll hand back to Tom and close the meeting.
Thanks very much, everyone. So we are, as you say, it's 13:59 and 59 seconds. So the meeting comes to a conclusion. Thank you very much for the Scot-GEM team for coming back I will try and flag up all the Scot-GEM talks on the YouTube channel. So if you're interested in what was said 10 years ago, 6 years ago, 15 years ago about Scot-GEM, then you should hopefully be able to go and watch that and marvel at the fact that I still have the same shirt 15 years ago that I do today. Next week, I'm just looking at my other screen because that's where my diary is. We have Tony Pelosi, who asked a question, and he's going to speak to us about personality and fatal diseases, exposing a scientific scandal. So that's a provocative title. He tells me it's a fairly provocative talk. So do please come along for that next week.
And I'm going to say at the beginning as well, the more screens that are on, the better. I mean, I think it's so important to have the screens on. I want more screens on. But
There you go. Susie's put a screen on for you.
If I
Just
get
after
carried
solidarity.
away, I need to see people saying, "No, don't say that. Don't say that."
There you go. You've got an avalanche of screens being turned on. So next week, it's you've heard it from Tony. Screens on for Grand Rounds. So Kirsty and Fiona and Lloyd and Panna and somebody else. Thank you so much for your talk today, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.